So right now, things are erupting inside and across Iran as the people push back against the oppressive Islamic Republic in a way we just haven't seen before. This isn't another protest flare-up. These are protests that are moving in a coordinated, unified fashion with increasingly international recognition and support, including from Reza Pahlavi, the Crown Prince. It's the perfect storm forming a convergence of pressures the regime is just not seemingly ready to admit it cannot handle. Nationwide protests across all the major cities, not on the margins or in the countryside. A collapsing currency, the rial, pushing daily life and economic possibilities to the brink. The leadership reeling from its military setbacks and increasing isolation, and a far more overall hostile geopolitical environment. And of course, the continued explicit pressure from Donald Trump and the US. So when your core partners are no longer able or willing to support you, when the recent conflicts have left you exposed, and when the people are finally standing up in very clear-cut unison, shouting mantras of down with the regime, there is no question about how big this is. So in this video, I wanted to build on a previous one, looking at what is happening inside the country in ways the media just are not covering sufficiently, why these matter so much more than you think, and how it could all come to a head in a much bigger way.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back. This time we are returning to Iran's protests specifically as they continue to grow in both magnitude and frequency. In many people's eyes, we are reaching a critical mass. And of course, I therefore welcome your comments below in solidarity with the Iranian people or with your own thoughts and suggestions, as this is where the story really turns. There is not a set of abstract, say, economics or spreadsheets. This is very much real life, real people taking to the streets and increasingly pushing against the security services, the regime that intends to oppress them. This immediate trigger has been around the collapse of the economy, the 1.4 million rials to the dollar, inflation surging past 50%, and the cost of basic goods rising beyond each levels for any ordinary citizen to accept. The protest cycle began when economic pain was felt most directly. The bazaar. In Tehran's Grand Bazaar, the Lelazar and Alindin markets, shopkeepers were shutting their stalls and taking to the streets. This was followed by the students, universities mobilizing. And within a week, protests spread far beyond the capital of Tehran to every major symbolic space, including for Iranian politics. These are what you call political accelerants. When merchants move, when students move, regimes tend to increasingly listen. The unrest has already crossed a certain threshold, and in many people's eyes, including those that are very experienced on this, we are in a new phase, a phase where you have many specific factors needed for a sustained resistance movement to exist, to occur. Direct confrontation with security forces, vehicles, especially of police set alight, gunfire reported, and several people now unfortunately losing their lives. These details, you see, matter more than any headline will suggest, because in Iran's political system, once members of the security forces begin to die or simply hold back getting involved, well, these protests are no longer economic grievances. They're classified as existential threats to the regime. Now, I'm going to come to what makes, to me, this particularly different. But first, let's compare it to previous protest movements, such as 2009 or 2022. The Mahsa Amini protests, as they're known, emerged from a moral and social crisis, not an economic one. They're about dignity, bodily autonomy, and repression, particularly against women. Iranian people are highly educated, and the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom" quickly captured a sense of generational revolt against authoritarian control. Women and youth stood at the forefront, transforming everyday acts of resistance into nationwide challenge to the regime's legitimacy. Now, as I say, this time it's rooted in economic failure, and that changes a lot of things. Merchants, the middle class, labourers, as well as students or women, were all pulled into the vortex this time. The message from the street is blunt, that economic collapse and political misrule are inseparable. Now, building on that, this is where it becomes genuinely dangerous, not just for the people, but for the regime, and why this wave starts to look different. One of the most important differences this time is the geography, and the regime knows this. In 2022, protests were initially concentrated in major cities. That made them easier to isolate, fragment, and ultimately repress, because it's where the biggest military assets, things like intelligence or the ability to use alternative forms of oppression or disinformation exist. But this time the unrest is spread across even the smaller marginalized towns, and those involved are mobilizing simultaneously, not in sporadic movements. That breadth, as well as the depth, matters. Economic protests tend to fail when they remain fragmented. They become dangerous, though, when they bridge class, geography, and identity. Just look at the Bolsheviks in 1917. Iran's own history, though, is clear on this point. The merchant class played a decisive role in both the 1906 constitutional revolution and the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So this is why the Islamic Republic is responding with a revealing playbook. At the top, the supreme leader, Khamenei, has struck a calibrated tone, a brief acknowledgement of grievances, an insistence that the system understands people's pain, but followed by a pivot to conspiracy, framing the protests as Western psychological warfare. We see time and again in history when an autocratic entity is losing control, well, it's always easier to blame something else, and especially blame something outside the country. Below the rhetoric layer, though, cosmetic gestures have followed: talk of dialogue, the recycling of failed technocrats, the resignation and resurrection of central bank figures, for example. Now, these are pressure valves, but they're not solutions. And crucially, the civilian government has no real levers, increasingly. Everyone in Iran understands that power does not sit with the presidency, but with the supreme leader and the overall security apparatus, especially the IRGC. So that's why these chants that you hear on the streets increasingly are very much about ending that system, not just about reforming it to an extent. Now, let me know if you're finding this breakdown useful, then do consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you know when I release the latest update on these critical developments. One of the most striking of these, though, is that late last year, the shift in both protest and political expectations shifted. Women life freedom, for example, is symbolically powerful. But when you start protesting and chanting directly down with the dictatorship or change the regime, this is a much more significant shift. New chants emerging explicitly about power. Javed Shah, this is the final battle. Pahlavi will return. Now, some might argue that these are primarily slogans used by monarchists, but they overall represent a significant departure from the largely Republican rights-based framing of 2022, because so many more people who might not identify purely as monarchists are chanting them. They reflect a political exhaustion and a growing belief that reform within the Islamic Republic system is no longer enough or simply possible. And so the reform question becomes inseparable from the Reza Pahlavi movement. For years, the regime has relied on a familiar cycle of this repression, cosmetic concessions, recycled technocrats, etc. The current protest waves exposes that bankruptcy of logic, and Reza Pahlavi, who I will come to in a second, is certainly taking advantage of that. As with any resistance movement, you need a clear figurehead, someone who can coordinate and represent the face of that resistance. And Reza Pahlavi certainly seems to be taking up that role. In contrast, current President Masoud Pezeshkian has no real solutions, because the problems facing Iran do not sit with the presidency. As I say, they sit with the supreme leader, and therefore the protests know that they have to focus on the very top, where the actual power rests, not with a simple individual who can make a few policy changes. In the sense, reform. They want regime change, which requires the Khamenei, the supreme leader, to be gone. So this shift creates space, for the first time, for a figure like Reza Pahlavi to matter politically as part of the transition towards a democratic, or rid of at least the Islamic Republic, not just symbolically. And this is where I think the most important development is. For the first time since the protests began, the exiled Crown Prince has issued direct and operational calls to action. Not vague encouragement or abstract solidarity, but is specifically instructed, stating over the past days to coordinate chants at exactly 8 p.m. across Iran on consecutive nights, whether in the streets or from people's homes. This matters because protest movements don't succeed, as I say, on anger alone. They succeed when they achieve coordination, scale, rhythm. A figurehead, of which Pahlavi's intervention is not about leading the protest from abroad in a traditional sense, but about testing whether a nationwide response is there and whether the fear has begun to crack in the Islamic Republic. His message is, of course, aimed at the security forces as well. The appeal is explicit and unusually direct. Do not fire on the people. Decide which side of history you stand on. He frames this not as treason, but as a choice about personal survival, family security, and national legitimacy. Ultimately, the regime's durability doesn't rest on ideology, it rests on obedience. And for anyone who thinks about the Islamic Republic being purely theocratic, it's too simplistic. There is a very strong pragmatism that has allowed this entity to exist in power and develop as effective proxy network as it did over the past 40 plus years. And of course, all of this is unfolding in a far harsher geopolitical environment for Tehran than 3-4 years ago. Externally, Iran is under sustained and increasing direct pressure from the US, Trump's America. Washington has escalated its campaign of tanker seizures and indictments, targeting vessels linked to Iran's oil exports and sanction evasion networks. They're not symbolic, they are directly linked to one of the few remaining revenue streams propping up the Iranian economy and reinforcing the sense that Tehran economic suffocation is no longer just a hypothetical. The loss of Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela is one of the biggest blows for Iran or the Islamic Republic in the past 6 months. Venezuela is one of the main areas that it had a location in the Western Hemisphere, America's backyard, that could facilitate cooperation, the sanctions evasion, the diplomatic cover, coordinating with Moscow, Beijing, and others. Caracas was so important, but that safety valve has gone, and regionally the damage is even more severe if you think about how that plays into the region. Iran's confrontation with Israel over a trade war exposed the limits of its deterrence and resulted in significant blows to its military infrastructure. On top of that, it has basically seen the effective and systematic dismantling of its proxy network. The strategy of asymmetric power projection, plausible deniability have been degraded, disrupted, or completely destroyed. And those who might have been able to come to the aid of what's happening in the country right now don't exist. Nation states like Syria are gone, and the collapse of the Assad regime removed one of Iran's most important regional allies and logistical corridors, severing a critical link in Tehran's regional architecture along what's known as the Shia Crescent. So this continuous arc of influence is now fragmented, brittle, or just non-existent. Couple that with the continued rhetoric and provocations by Trump about getting involved or supporting the Iranian people's resistance makes it even worse and fearful, to the point that it seems that Khamenei may be even seeking to evacuate to Moscow or Russia in the event of things getting out of control. Faced with this pressure, though, Cooker, Iranian diplomats are sort of probing for talks, not to make concessions, but to try and buy time. A drawn-out negotiation process, even without a deal, can stabilize the rial, calm the markets, and reduce the immediate risk of further strikes. History offers little reason to believe this will succeed. In 2009, during the Green Movement, Iran rejected diplomatic overtures. And in 2022, amid the other social movements, it again refused compromise. So the pattern is consistent. The Islamic Republic does not bend under internal pressure because doing so would signal weakness at a moment when the system is most exposed. Therefore, all of this in mind, it seems like the Iranian people are very well aware of this. They've had enough, and they are pushing back in ways that we have not seen in decades. The waves threaten its economic foundations and the ability for the Islamic Republic to command a sense of not just social, but economic and political control. Moreover, the international community is really taking notice and, in some ways, beginning to get more directly involved. There is no question to me that the Americans and certainly Israel, or specifically Mossad, are likely on the ground fanning the flames in certain ways, being influences to encourage more social discontent resistance. All these things compound accumulated anger, economic despair, a collapsing sense of legitimacy, but also a real sense of hope and enthusiasm that something better is on the horizon and can replace it. And all it takes is for the Iranian people to take that momentum, that initiative, and they are certainly doing that. This makes the moment far more consequential than it might appear at first glance. And as always, I will be coming back to you with latest updates to continue to support the Iranian people in liberating Iran. But that's it from me. Let me know in the comments below what you think about developments here, and if you'd like to see more coverage or engagement on specific angles, then let me know, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.